Rudyard Kipling is an author most people are likely to encounter in their childhood via the Jungle Books. That's probably the most common route that someone reading him will encounter him. Or they will watch the Disney adaptations or other adaptations and then turn to the books. It's certainly how I encountered him, and at age 8 or 9 or so, I had no idea about Kipling's views about the Irish or his political connections. They're not something 8 or 9-year-olds think about, and after all. A bit later, I read Kim, and you can see an open copy of Kim over to the left there, with the Zamzama gun, which appears in the first chapter, and we'll get to why that gun is important in a minute. Now, I noticed that Kim was identified as an Irish kid, but I wasn't familiar enough with Kipling's life history to take any great notice of it, and it's just a rollicking adventure story for kids. Now, in the middle here, you have a picture celebrating the signing of the Ulster Covenant, which we'll also come back to in a bit, and that intersects with Kipling's life as well. Now, I've titled this Rudyard Kipling and the Irish, an uneasy but close relationship. I was going to call it a love-hate relationship, but even that seemed simplistic. I'm going to go on in the following slides to detail how the Irish are used in some of Kipling's literature, not all of it. Kipling wrote an extraordinarily large body of works, and it would take a long time to go through all of them, so I've selected some key examples, with Kim being probably the most prominent. So without further ado, I'll introduce Kim. I've used the wonders of AI here to give us a brief summary of Kim, and as I've titled it, it's probably the novel by Kipling which features the Irish most people would probably name. It's probably the most famous of his novels that has the Irish in a prominent role, although there are some other works by him that use them quite a lot. And AI has given us this great summary. Kim is a picaresque novel by Rudyard Kipling, first published in 1901. That explores the adventures of a young Irish orphan navigating life in British-ruled India during the late 19th century. And it's tried to summarise the plot thus. The story centres around Kimball O'Hara, known as Kim, who is the orphan son of an Irish soldier. Raised in the bustling streets of Lahore, he becomes a resourceful and cunning street boy, blending seamlessly into the diverse cultures of India. Kim's life takes a significant turn when he befriends a Tibetan Lama, who is on a spiritual quest to find the River of the Arrow. He becomes the Lama's disciple, and together they embark on a journey across India. All true, but in the usual AI way, while it's produced that lovely burb which would fit nicely on a DVD case or a book, there's a great deal more going underneath, such as it notes in the last bit of the summary it gives, the Great Game, which is a geopolitical conflict between Britain, Russia, and imperial interests in Asia. And Kim is recruited by Mahbali, and the name should tell you that Mahbali is a Muslim. So you have a Muslim recruiting an Irish child who suddenly becomes English sometimes in the text, and you have a Buddhist wandering through it. So you have people who may have all sorts of divided loyalties and may be involved in these spy games surely for the thrill of it or the backsheesh. Although Kipling presents those that are involved in them, such as Kim and Mahbali, as representatives of the best of their class, if you will, and loyal to the empire because of that, and by showing it, they show they are the best of their class, a rather circular argument. The reality was probably somewhat more complicated. What's the best way to understand an author? It's an endless question, but the one possible answer, and I think the best answer, is read some of his work. All the critical studies in the world won't help unless you've read some of their work. And this is a little bit of the first chapter of Kim. And the reason I've picked the opening is because it shows how magnificent Kipling is at packing in a load of cultures and a load of details. And you could endlessly decode this first little section. And I'm going to read it. Chapter 1. O ye who tread the narrow way, by Tophet flare to judgment day. Be gentle when the heathen pray to Buddha at Kamakura. He sat, in defiance of municipal orders, astride the gun Samsama on a brick platform opposite the old Ajab Gir, the Wonder House as the natives call the Lahore Museum, who holds Samsama, that fire-breathing dragon, holder in Punjab. For the great green bronze place is always first of the conqueror's loot. There was some justification for Kim. He had kicked Lala Deneth's boys off the Tranians. Since the English held the Punjab and Kim was English, though he was burned black as any native, though he spoke the vernacular by preference, and his mother tongue in a clipped, uncertain sing-song, though he concerted on tones of perfect equality with the small boys of the bazaar. Kim was white, a poor white of the very poorest, the half-caste woman who looked after him. She smoked opium and pretended to keep a second-hand furniture shop by the square, where the cheap cabs wait, told the missionaries that she was Kim's mother, but his mother had been a nursemaid in a colonel's family, and had married Kimball O'Hara, a young colour sergeant of the Mavericks, an Irish regiment, and I'm going to decode some of that on the next slide. Let's have a look at how many things Kipling manages to fit into a small passage. Firstly, you have a huge number of religions. He manages to fit in Christianity. In fact, you could argue he manages to fit in two forms of Christianity via Kim, who is the son of a poor colour sergeant, which probably implies that Kim's father was Catholic, and Anglicanism was the preferred religion of the upper classes of the English Empire, or the British Empire, if you will. He fits in Hinduism, via Lala Deneth. He fits in Buddhism, via the quote at the top. And he fits in Islam, and he fits Islam in a particular way, which I'll come back to in a moment. The canon fits Islam in, and he managed to fit in how those religions interact to a degree as well, via the motif of the canon. The canon is an example of an empire that's declined, namely the Mughal Empire, and that's why he makes the point about it being the first piece of loot that people capture. It's still there today. It's still sitting there, and it's still a major tourist landmark, and people can still look at it and see where it was. And he even managed to make a nod roundabout reference to Japan. The Buddha Kamakura is referring to a large-scale statue of the Buddha there. You have a load of empires that have intersected. Of course, Kipling is at pains to present the British Empire's case, so Kim is sitting on the canon. He's in the position of power, the position where he's kicked Lala Deneth off the Trunnions. He is in charge. Yet, notice how he's English to start the chapter, and then he's the son of an Irishman at the end of it. I'm not the first person by any means to notice that, how Kim's identity fluctuates like that throughout the text. He moves from being English, as needed, when he's been more civilised, to being Irish, when he's been less civilised or engaged in spycraft. And what that betrays of Kipling's views of the Irish is open to interpretation. You also have a large number of ethnic groups in there. Indian, Punjabi, Persian, Irish. The Buddhist quote implies Tibet and Nepal. In a small section of text, Kipling has crammed a huge amount of detail. And he's also managed to work his own family in there in a roundabout way. The Lahore Museum, the Wonder House, was where his own father was one of the first curators. And his father, John Lockwood Kipling, is probably better known in India nowadays than he is in Britain, and mentored many artists and architects. It's a magnificent example of how a really skilled author can cram in a huge amount of detail into a small section of text. On the grounds that, using the old cliche that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and cliches are, let's face it, the basics in the toolbox of conversation many times. Here's a picture of the Wonder House, where John Lockwood Kipling was one of the first creators, and there he is in the middle, with a young Rudyard Kipling who seems to be anticipating the Beatles by a considerable margin of years. Obviously he's lacking a guitar though to play any rock tunes on. That's the canon down the bottom, which is a rather mighty thing in reality, and has entered into popular folklore apparently in India, where people who are reputed to have sexual powers and virility are compared to the gun. Now, I don't intend to go through all of Kipling's literary works. That would be nearly impossible, or would require about 20 or 30 videos, but I've selected two examples. One is reasonably well known still, and that's Stalky & Co. The other, My Known People, is far less known. It's not really read that much anymore, and it doesn't have the fame of the Jungle Books or the Just So stories or anything like that that Kipling wrote, but it is noteworthy for two tales that deal in depth with the Irish. One is Namgay Doola, which deals with a bandit who's of mixed Irish and Indian heritage, and that's sort of what Kipling might call miscegenation. Is unusual in his works, the recognition that there was an Anglo-Irish community of this sort. It also tells you a lot about his views of the Irish, as it ends with his views that the Irish are great for sort of fighting, and nobody can beat them for that, and they're massively patriotic, but they're not particularly good at governing themselves, and that they should never be given governance themselves. And that relates back to his views on Home Rule, which we'll come to shortly. He viewed the Irish as people who needed to be governed due to their deficiencies in these regards. They were part of the British peoples, but a part that needed to be kept under some control, seems to be the view. And there's also another story, The Mutiny of the Mavericks, which deals with a regiment of Irish soldiers mentioned in Kim, it's the same regiment, and a Fenian conspiracy. The Fenian conspiracy starts with a page where Kipling more or less caricatures the Fenian plotters as complete morons, but it also involves Indian plotters seeking Indian independence, and it all goes badly wrong because the Irish soldiers are characterised as not too interested at all, and they can only recruit about a handful from the whole regiment, and the rest of the soldiers are more interested in when their beer rations are going to be supplied. A rather shallow understanding, I think, of the politics of Ireland is seen in that story, and it's not the best of his tales, in my opinion. Stalky & Co. is still read to some extent. It's a novel concerning adolescence. It's set at a boarding school based on the United Services College that Kipling attended as a boy. And one of the more prominent characters is MacTurk. Now, MacTurk is an offshoot of the Anglo-Irish classes, and thus likely to be Protestant. It's not impossible for him to be a Catholic, but it's more likely that he was Protestant. And yet, throughout the text, Kipling will differentiate him by having him using Irish demotic speech and behaving as a hothead and getting into grumpy moods due to his Irishness. Which is fascinating, how he's created a form of Irishness that transcends almost heritage, and that he's deployed in that way. As I say, the Home Rule crisis is something that Kipling felt very, very strongly about. And in 1912 you had the Ulster Covenant, which I've given a brief definition of it here. Ulster was solemn League and Covenant, commonly known as the Ulster Covenant, was signed by nearly 500,000 people on and before the 28th of September 1912, in protest against the Third Home Rule Bill introduced by the British government in the same year. Now, it still has major repercussions in Ireland and Northern Ireland to this day, and the Unionist population treasure its memory. It also led to events such as the Curragh Mutiny, and in the long run you had the Easter Rising and the Anglo-Irish War and Partition. On the next page there's a particular poem by Kipling where he summarises his feelings about it, which is still a reasonably well-known poem, and it's worth reading out. Ulster. Their webs shall not become garments, neither shall they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and the act of violence is in their hands. The dark 11th hour draws on, and sees us sold to every evil power we fought against of old. Rebellion, rapine, hate, oppression, wrong and greed are to rule our faith, by England's act and deed. The faith in which we stand, the laws which made and guard, our honour, lives and land, are given for reward, to murder done by night, to treason thought by day, to folly, sloth and spite, and we are trussed away. The blood our fathers spilt, our love, our toils, our pains are counted for guilt, and only bind our chains before an empire's eye. The traitor claims his price, what need of further lies? We are the sacrificed. We asked no more than leave to reap where we had sown, through good and ill to cleave to our own flag and throne. Now England's shot and steel beneath that flag must show how loyal hearts should kneel to England's oldest foe. We know the war prepared on every peaceful home. We know the hells declared for such as serve not Rome, that there are threats and dread in market, hearth and field. We know when all is said, we perish if we yield. Believe, we dare not boast. Believe, we do not fear. We stand to pay the cost in all that men hold dear. What answer from the north? One law, one land, one throne. If England drive us forth, we shall not fall alone. It's those last lines that summarise the contentious and odd relationship of unionism with the rest of the UK. The threat, if England drive us forth, we shall not fall alone. Because the Unionists and the Republicans were both happy enough to take arms from the Germans. The difference being that the Unionists took a very, very large quantity just prior to World War I, around 30 to 35,000 rifles, if I remember, whereas the Republicans smuggled in something like 1,500 to 2,000 rifles, and yet the Unionist community, a blind eye was turned. This happened. Whereas with the Republicans in Dublin, the Bachelor's Walk massacre occurred with several civilians being killed. And this poem summons up the tension of the Ulster men feeling that they are part of Britain, but that they are a part of Britain that is being ignored via the central power. And it's that tension that Kipling has played on to write this piece of rhetorical poetry. It's almost propagandist, I would argue. And yet it's hard not to feel sorry for Kipling, as his life was linked with Ireland in another way. That's his son, John Kipling, there, second lieutenant, who died in World War I. Jack, as he called him, was initially not perhaps his favourite child. He had a younger daughter who died around age 7. And yet Jack, who died in the Irish Guards, summarises in a small way the tragedy of the many Irish and English people who died then, and people from other parts of what was then the UK. That small picture of a young man who was only 18 years and 6 weeks old when he died is in some ways pathetic. You can't help but look at it and think, what could that young man have gone on to achieve? That's John Kipling's memorial by Sir Herbert Baker down at the bottom. He also appears on several other memorials, and there's a grave for him. And there's also a controversy about whether it's his body in it, which I'll come to in a moment. It occurred long after Kipling's own death. And Kipling himself, despite his contentious relationship with the views of the Irish, was not shy to stump up money to help out members of John's regiment when they got in trouble paying funeral bills or trying to organise masses for the deceased. So it would be an attempt to dehumanise him to suggest he hated the Irish or had no fellow feeling for them as human beings. Long after Kipling's own death, a body showed up which is arguably John Kipling. This is Frank McNally writing for the Irish Times in 2015. As Ronan McGreevy mentioned in passing here on Tuesday, it's 100 years this week since the death of John Jack Kipling, son of Rudyard Kipling, whose war had barely begun when, after a month after turning 17, he died in the Battle of Lewes on September the 27th, 1915, plunging his father who had pulled strings to get the Irish Guards to ignore his short-sightedness and give him a commission integral to even grief. Not that Kipling knew his death then, for long afterwards he clung to the words of a commanding officer who had written, "Two of my men saw your son limping, and I'm very hopefully he's a prisoner." Now, Kipling died without ever finding out whether there was a body to bury or not. Kipling spent the rest of the war hoping the boy was still alive somewhere, and years afterwards searching for his body. But written in late 1915, his poem My Boy Jack was already striking the fatalistic note of someone waiting for the sea to give up the dead. "Have you news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. What do you think that he'll come back?" As you can see, I think he was slowly coming to terms with the fact that the young man was dead. He himself will be long dead, with his son's remains were identified in 1992. Well, there is an argument, and it's beyond the scope of this presentation to go into it at length, whether it is Jack's body or it's not. It's a young man who was an officer in the Irish Guards, but there were lots of young men who were probably officers in the Irish Guards, so there's proponents of the view that it is Jack and proponents of the view that it's not. I don't take a position on it, but I mention it just to give information. Given Kipling's, shall we say, somewhat problematic views of various races, normally the Indians are ones mentioned for this, although he has views that can be difficult to wrestle with of other races, how can we approach him? I'll approach it from my viewpoint of looking at it as we were here of the Irish in Kipling's works, and these are my thoughts on it. Whilst Kipling presents a particular view of the Irish as wild and passionate spirits whose virtues and vices are integral to their nature as a people, he sees them as part of the white race, but a part that needs managing. Rather than ignoring this aspect of his work and rejecting utterly, it seems fairer to deal with these attitudes and try to examine in detail how they intersect with his other outlooks. The Irish are both inside and outside the tent of the British Empire in his work. Examining their role in his work sheds light on how he approaches other groups. Also, despite Kipling's views on these issues, it would seem unwise to just bin his works because there are elements that may be problematic. This seems a losing strategy in the long run with regard to literature. Kipling's work also offers insights into human natures and what motivates humankind that are still of value today. For me, the discerning reader should be capable of facing a challenge in literature where the author may not agree with them or always mirror their outlooks. It's inevitable that that's not going to happen, especially when you read a wide range of literature.